Back in 1996, a student at the University of Tübingen in Germany found himself increasingly frustrated with the state of desktop computing on Unix systems. Matthias Ettrich was studying computer science and using Linux daily, but he kept running into the same problem over and over. Every application he used looked different from the others. Each program had its own way of doing things, its own menus, its own settings, its own peculiar behaviors. Nothing felt connected or consistent for developers and system administrators. This was just part of the Unix experience. You learned each tool separately, and you got used to it. But Ettrich saw something that bothered him more deeply. He realized that for regular people, for end users who just wanted to get work done, this chaotic landscape was a deal-breaker. How could anyone expect ordinary users to adopt an operating system where every application required learning a completely new interface? On October 14, 1996, Ettrich decided to do something about it. He posted a now famous announcement to various Usenet newsgroups calling for developers to help build something better. He envisioned a complete desktop environment, one where applications would share a consistent look and feel, where settings would be centralized, and where the whole system would be designed with actual users in mind, rather than just technical experts. The name he chose was KDE, and it was a bit of a playful jab at the computing establishment of the time. CDEs, which stood for Common Desktop Environment, was the standard Unix desktop backed by major technology companies. It was proprietary and expensive. Ettrich's project would be free and open. The K in KDE was originally suggested to stand for cool, a tongue-in-cheek spelling that reflected the enthusiasm of early open-source communities. But that did not last long. The community quickly decided the K should not really stand for anything specific. It was just KDE, a name that had become its own thing. What Ettrich started that day would grow into one of the largest and most influential open-source projects in the world. But in the beginning, it was simply one student who wanted Unix to be approachable for everyone, not just the technically inclined. When Matthias Ettrich and his fellow developers set out to build a desktop environment, they faced a critical choice. They needed a graphical toolkit, the underlying framework that handles Windows buttons and all the visual elements users interact with. The decision they made would shape KDE's entire future. They chose Qt, a framework created in 1995 by a Norwegian company called Trolltech. At the time, Qt stood out as the best graphical toolkit available for Unix systems. It was well-designed, efficient, and made application development significantly easier for developers trying to create a usable desktop environment. Quickly, Qt was the obvious choice. The toolkit was available free of charge for anyone developing free software, and its source code was openly distributed. But that decision sparked immediate controversy in the free software community. Qt was not released under a completely free software license. Trolltech operated a commercial arm, meaning companies that wanted to create proprietary software using Qt had to purchase a license for open-source purists. This was unacceptable. They believed a free desktop environment should be built entirely on free software foundations. The criticism was fierce. Some argued that KDE's reliance on Qt created a fundamental conflict with free software principles. To address these concerns, the KDE project and Trolltech established the KDE Free Qt Foundation. This arrangement was designed to ensure Qt would remain available for free software development. The foundation had an unusual voting structure. 2 members represented KDE, and 2 represented Trolltech. If a vote ended in a tie, the KDE side would carry greater weight. This mechanism was meant to protect the community's interests if Trolltech ever stopped making Qt freely available. Not everyone was satisfied. Some developers launched the Harmony project, an ambitious effort to create a clone of Qt that would be fully free software from the start. The project made rapid progress, demonstrating that the community could build its own alternative if necessary. The controversy eventually resolved itself when Trolltech made the decision to re-license Qt under the GPL. The Harmony project was discontinued, having achieved its purpose by applying pressure on Trolltech to change its licensing terms. Things moved quickly after that first announcement. Within just 12 months, by October 1997, the team had already produced their first beta release. That beta was significant for another reason too. The release notes made a point of clarifying something important about what KDE actually was. It was not simply a window manager, as some had assumed. It was an integrated desktop environment, where the window manager was just one component among many. This distinction mattered because it showed the ambition behind the project. The developers were not just building tools to manage Windows on screen. They were creating a complete, cohesive experience for the user. The pace of development was remarkable. By early 1997, programmers outside the core team had already started building their own applications using KDE and Qt. This was a promising sign. It meant that developers saw real potential in the platform and were willing to invest their time in it. A desktop environment lives or dies by its applications. After all, if nobody builds software for it, it remains an empty shell. Seeing external contributors get involved so early suggested that the community understood this and was ready to help fill that shell with useful tools. Then came July 12, 1998. KDE's 1.0 was officially released. The announcement called it an integrated desktop environment for Unix operating systems, and it represented nearly 2 years of work from that initial idea to something users could actually install and use daily. The journey from a frustrated student's proposal to a complete software release had taken less time than anyone might have expected. The foundation was now in place, and the community that had formed around it was ready to keep building. The turn of the millennium marked a turning point for the project. On October 23, 2000, KDE 2.0 arrived, and it was something special. This release introduced a modular internet-enabled desktop that felt modern in ways the previous versions simply could not. The architecture had been rethought from the ground up, allowing components to work together more seamlessly than before. Then came April 3, 2002, when KDE 3.0 launched. This version brought a new printing framework called KDePrint, which gave users far more control over how they handled documents. But what really stood out was the language support. The project had been translated into 50 languages, which meant people across the world could use the desktop in their native tongue. That kind of accessibility mattered. The 3X series continued to mature, and by the time KDE 3.5 rolled out, users had access to some genuinely useful tools. Super Caramba let people customize their desktops with small applets that displayed information at a glance. The music player Amarok became a favorite almost immediately. Caffeine handled video playback, and K3B gave people a reliable way to burn media. These applications turned the desktop into something you could actually live in day to day. Then came January 11, 2008. KDE 4.0 marked the fourth major version milestone, and it represented another fundamental shift in how the desktop worked. The team had spent years preparing for this moment. rethinking everything from the visuals down to the core libraries. It was an ambitious release, one that would set the stage for everything that followed. As the KDE project grew beyond its initial spark, the community realized they needed something more than just shared enthusiasm. They needed legal standing. This led to the formation of KDE EV, a registered association based in Germany that would serve as the official legal representation for the entire project. Having a formal organization meant KDE could enter contracts, hold assets, and protect its interests in ways that a loose group of volunteers simply could not. The summer of 2002 marked a turning point for the project's identity. In August, board members of KDE EV gathered for a meeting that would shape how the world saw KDE for years to come. They decided to register the KDE brand as a trademark, protecting the name that had become synonymous with free desktop computing. This was not just bureaucracy, it was about claiming ownership of an identity that thousands of contributors had helped build. Speaking of identity, the project's visual symbol went through its own transformation. For early versions, a wizard character named Gandalf served as the project mascot, playing on the magical possibilities of the desktop environment. But in April 1999, a new character appeared. Conky, a friendly green dragon, was introduced as an animated assistant for the KDE Help Center. The community took such a liking to this little dragon that Conky eventually replaced Gandalf entirely as the official mascot, becoming the face that longtime users still recognize today. The community also recognized that open source had a diversity problem. In March 2001, KDE Women was announced with a clear mission to increase the number of women participating in free software communities, particularly within KDE. It was an early acknowledgement that building great software meant welcoming everyone to the table. Then, there was the matter of bringing people together face to face. In August 2003, about 100 contributors from various countries gathered at a castle in the Czech Republic for an event called Castle. It was the precursor to something bigger. The following year, in August 2004, the first official academy took place in Ludwigsburg, Germany. The name came from the venue, a film school called Filmakademie, but it stuck. Academy became the annual international gathering where community members could meet, plan, and celebrate what they had built together. Then came November 24, 2009, a date that would reshape how everyone understood what KDE actually was. The community announced a fundamental rebranding that had been brewing for some time. The letters KDE would no longer stand for K Desktop Environment. Instead, KDE would simply be KDE, the name of the community itself. This was not merely a cosmetic change or a marketing decision. It represented a profound shift in how the project saw itself and wanted others to see it. The practical side of this rebranding involved splitting what had been known as KDE 4 into three distinct components. There was KDE Plasma Workspaces, which handled the desktop interface itself. Then came KDE Applications, the suite of programs that users interacted with daily. Finally, there was KDE Frameworks, underlying libraries and technologies that developers could build upon. These three pieces together were bundled under the name KDE Software Compilation, for a mouthful of a term that made it clear. This was software produced by a community, not just a desktop environment. The reasoning behind all this made perfect sense when you stepped back and looked at what KDE had become. The project had grown far beyond its original scope. It was no longer just about creating a desktop for Unix systems. The community was now producing applications that could run on multiple platforms. development frameworks used by other projects and technologies that extended well beyond any single desktop environment. The old name had become a constraint, suggesting something smaller than what the project had actually become. By rebranding, KDE was acknowledging that its greatest strength lay not in any particular piece of software, but in the people creating it.